This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke. This week we are going to, might be getting towards the end of our foray into Slavic mythology and Slavic folklore. And our subject this week is going to be the Latawica. Okay, now the Latawica, there's a few different definitions of this word. So those of you who speak Polish may have one interpretation of this word when you hear it. But the Latawice are a certain class of what we call demon or demonic spirit, and the Latawica, where in this case we are referring to this particular demon that is supposed to be the soul of an unborn child. But Latawica being the feminine of that, there's a male and female version, but this is the female version. But however, the term Latawica actually refers to a couple of other things as well. If you look it up, it becomes slang for a woman who is the term that was actually used in the dictionary was a slut. But a woman who is considered to be promiscuous on some kind of terms, whether monetary or not. And in fact, I think there's a Polish term for prostitute that is often listed as a synonym for Latawica. And the term also more generally refers to, you'll see, to kite. As in the thing that you fly in the sky, but also kite as a kind of there's a certain type of an animal called a kite. There's a marsupial that's known as a kite, and when you go to the Polish, kind of Wikipedia, the term is actually translated as kite, okay, or at least the more general term is, and it's interesting to see all of these associations together, okay? So demon of unborn children, woman who is sexually promiscuous, and this idea of this thing that flies, okay? Whether we think of it as the kind of paper kite or however it's made that we fly, as a type of entertainment, or at least people used to fly as a type of entertainment. And the animal that has a similar shape to that, I suppose, to what we think of as a kite. So this is kind of a little bit of a weird one. So, where do we begin with this? Okay. Well, first of all, I think it would be good to tell the mythology, the actual tale. There's a couple of different sites. I have the one from Lamastworsky, has a site of Slavic folklore and mythology. There's a lot. It's very hard to find a lot of stuff in English. I'm finding for a lot of this. So I'm relying on some of these other sources that seem that feel credible and reliable to me. So, okay, so this term, so I'm just going to read this directly from his site. Okay, so the Latawice and their female counterparts, Latawica, were demons believed to be souls of the aborted or stillborn children, but also of people who died suddenly, for example, a hanged criminal. Originally, they were not seen as particularly hostile to people, though could be dangerous due to their restless nature, identified with the unpredictable forces of the wind. Their appearance was resembling birds, okay, particularly black ones like ravens or rooks. We could interpret that they were shape-shifting in nature because many tales describe them with human parts, for example, a face or legs, or even looking like regular people, only with wings instead of arms. They were mostly night creatures, often arriving with the winds, whirls, and storms. People also believed that Latawice could die when hit by lightning. If bribed with the right offerings, spells, and prayers, they could become home spirits and helped around the house, for example, to guide moderate winds to the windmills. But an offended Latawice could become vicious. In some regions of Poland, it was even believed that fires started by lightnings were caused by these demons, and that they were seducing young people with their irresistible form of appearance, whispering in the winds and eventually driving their victims insane. Due to the influence of Christianity in Poland, this folk belief was changing over the centuries. For example, the origin myth of their creation started to include also the unbaptized children. Restless nature of Latace was demonized, compared to devils, and overly sexualized. Still, in early 20th century, girls were warned not to go out alone on windy or stormy nights because a Latavse could lure them and force them to commit a sin of impurity. Over the time, the female verb Latawica became even a popular synonym for a promiscuous woman in the Polish language. The word Latace in the modern Polish also means a kite. They are both simply derived from the verb, and I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, latat, I'm not sure how that C is pronounced, which means to fly. It's Latac with an accent on the C. So there you go. So that's the, this is the origin story in its most complete form that I've seen. And okay, so we can learn several things here, and there's several different aspects of this that I want to address in this podcast. Well, first of all, we definitely have this idea of a winged creature. And again, being associated with ravens or rooks, and also with the wind. So these are spirits of the air, or spirits of the winds. And the winds, and their nature could, again, very much like wind, has to do with whether or not they are helpful, as they say, the wind driving the windmill, or whether or not they are destructive. Because as we know, certain windstorms can, knock things down. Certainly in modern times, when we think about, say, hurricane force winds, they, can knock down power lines and leave people, I think about Hurricane Sandy back in 2012 and how for 2 weeks, mainly because of the high winds, at least in this area, more than the water, pretty much everything was dead for 2 weeks. You couldn't get, unless you had a generator, there was no electricity for 2 or 3 weeks. And even a lot of the businesses didn't, people were fighting in the places where the businesses actually had something. So this is a pretty important element. And this, certainly we see here from an elemental perspective that this is about dealing with some kind of, really we're talking about, they call it a demon, but really, a demonic figure, an air elemental of some kind. And also associated with lightning. So there's this air-fire combination that goes on there. Lightning is something that we typically see associated in many mythologies with, usually the god king. So Zeus or Jupiter or Jove in the Greek and Roman, Indra certainly in the Hindu thinking, and Lugh in the Irish, just to name a few. I mean, there's certainly others, but those are the main ones that we could think of. I think about Thor, for example, in Norse mythology. Although I don't think he's technically considered to be the king of the gods there, but he is certainly a very important deity. Generally, the lightning, so all of these things were considered to be very, this was a way of dealing with it. And it's interesting that these particular spirits are said to be spirits of the unborn, because the wind is actually just a very, very natural phenomenon. I mean, there's like everything else. And like all elements, there is a helpful aspect to them that can be harnessed, and there's also a destructive aspect that has to be, you have to be careful of. So I think I want to talk a little bit about that, the idea of these as wind deities or air deities. And also I want to talk about this idea of the unborn or aborted child, okay? And what the different inflections are, certainly what their original inflection was, and then what we see as the Christian inflection. And then I also want to talk about this link to promiscuous women as well. So those are the main points that I want to address in this podcast. Okay, so this elemental aspect of them, there's a really strong connection between the soul and air spirits or air beings. This is not, and again, there's a lot of Slavic mythology that we don't specifically know what the origins are. There may be some of it that comes out of perhaps original Roman thinking, even, just because it seems like there's a lot of Roman tradition that has made its way into many of the Eastern European countries. That does not mean that their origins are necessarily Roman, but just that there are some interesting similarities there that could have been brought, or at least could have been combined in that way. We do frequently see in a lot of places in Eastern Europe and even in the Mediterranean where you may have originally had a system of what we'll call religion. Religion to me has to do with something more organized and hierarchical. But, some sociologists and anthropologists will make that distinction between religion and magic, okay, which, I don't know. I mean, given the way people associate the term magic, I don't know that that's an entirely useful categorization. But okay, but let's just call it ancient religion for the time being, just for convenience sake. A lot of these they're very, very elemental in nature. When I teach Roman myth, a lot of people assume Greek and Roman myth are pretty much the same thing, but ancient Roman religion is not that at all. The deities, we literally go through all the different elemental deities associated with different types of fire, like Vulcan and Vesta. The ones associated with the forests, the ones who are associated with with the waters, of different types of waters, okay? The ones who are associated with rivers and springs versus lakes or the sea or the ocean. There's all of these different, ways of thinking about that. Deities associated with the air. There's the gods of the winds. And, we see in the Odyssey, for example, the Aeolus, the king of the winds, who gives a bag full of wind, who ties up all the unfavorable winds in a bag so that Odysseus can get home, and then his men stupidly open it and blow him straight back to where they started. There's definitely, and certainly for people who might have had any kind of seafaring life, the winds, of course, are very, very important to navigation and to being able to get to your destination. A huge part of the beginning of the Trojan War, certainly the whole Iphigenia at Aulis episode, has to do with the fact that Artemis, had the winds calmed. And in the Aeneid, you initially see this element of Hera having Hera appealing to Aeolus to calm the winds so that Aeneas can't get to his destination. And then, or sending very, very violent winds to try to rile everything up. And then Neptune, who is like Poseidon, stepping in and saying, hey, that's my domain, you can't do that. So it's, so anyway, there's this whole thing certainly around the winds and seafaring. Although, which might be part of the equation here, but I think what's more interesting is the idea of the winged creatures. I think I've said this before, whether you're talking about Egyptian mythology, Babylonian myth, certainly, and probably even in Greek and Roman in particular, because again, I focus on these areas because this is where I've done most of my research. There are other examples elsewhere as well. But the idea of the spirit or the soul, however that's defined, like the psyche or psyche in Greek, the anima in Roman speak, and and there's different elements of the soul. There's the ka and the ba. There's the body, and then there's the body of the soul, and there's all of these different elements within the Egyptian categorization of the soul. That all of them, and the Babylonian as well. Okay, you always the spirit of the dead is always represented as having wings. Okay, and our modern idea about both angelic and demonic beings tends to be one that has to do with wings. We tend to see angels as, in the more modern, cleaned up interpretations, as having almost bird-like wings. Although more ancient depictions will also show them with many, many layers of wings, folding in, and usually, possibly multiple heads and tons of eyeballs as well. But even our more sanitized version of the angels tends to show these human figures with wings. And when we think about demonic figures, they tend to be categorized more like bats, as having those kinds of wings that belong to night creatures in particular. In this case, we see them connected to crows and rooks. So we're talking about blackbirds. Okay, so again, there's this blackness, this not only Chtonic element, but this idea of the shapeshifter. And of course, again, I don't know that this is specifically the case within Slavic mythology, but frequently you will see things like, birds like crows and other corvids being associated not only with shape-shifting deities, but also with like having a tricksterish element to them. Okay. And when you think about wind and the associations with wind, it's kind of like, which way does the wind blow? I mean, that's usually something of an idiom or metaphor for for the idea of, something being completely unpredictable and changeable, which is that tricksterish kind of nature. You cannot say with certainty, what's going to happen or which way it's going to blow or what it's going to do, and whether it's going to be helpful or whether it's going to be more dangerous. But they're associated more, it seems, with storms. Okay, and like any deities, and again, this is also something we had seen in certainly we have evidence of in Rome, is the idea of you could make them one of your household spirits, or you could, through certain practical magic, you could, harness the power of the Latawica or the Latatse to bring helpful winds to your property or to your venture. Again, particularly in the case of windmills here. So it's a matter of this power of the wind. But the force of the storm, I think it's also interesting that the force of the storm is associated with seduction. And, honestly, there is something really seductive about a storm. I just did a bunch of photos. I had a friend visiting, and then after he had left, we just noticed this massive wind just whipping up, because we knew there were supposed to be storms incoming. And after he had gone home, I went, I have a cemetery right near my house, and I just found no, I want to go out in the cemetery, and watch the storm come in, And of course I had a number of photos from that, and, my hair is absolutely crazy because it's just, it was just kind of blowing everywhere. But there's a certain power and almost sexiness to a storm. I mean, it's, I love the energy of it. I mean, at the same time, depending on how destructive the storm is, it can be very, very scary. When I was in Ireland, I remember that that was actually, I never experienced thunderstorms in England. When I was in Ireland, though, it was a June day, and we suddenly had this real big, house shaking thunderstorm that, I know that my host was pretty freaked out by it. She's like, I'm just going to stay in this one room and not go anywhere. No. I was just kind of like, yeah, I want to go outside. I don't know. I always have a thing for storms. So, but there is certain power to it, and it can either be very, very frightening, or in some ways very, very seductive. There's something really just, I don't know. There's a feeling about a storm that's very, very chaotic, but somehow very beautiful at the same time. Maybe this is why they're associated with this kind of element of seduction. It's hard to say. And this seductive element, too, I think will tie in with the idea of the Latawica as a promiscuous woman, because also the male counterpart to the Latawica is somebody who is, also potentially a seductive male. But now it's weird if we back up and we think about this and what the connection is to unborn children. Unborn children are, okay, in our modern Christianized kind of culture, obviously abortion and debates about abortion and abortion rights are real big and topical right now, especially in the U.S., where the laws are becoming more restrictive in many states than once Roe v. Wade was overturned. And people are decidedly not happy about it because, those are decisions that should be between, a woman and her doctor, and not really, government should not really be involved in that. But some of the arguments that people have against abortion have to do with the idea of the fetus having a soul, and at what point the fetus has a soul. Now, from a strictly secular viewpoint, that's not something that should be under consideration. One might look about when does this fetus actually have something like a consciousness or a feeling, might be more the way that it is described. And that's there's different things that are written about it. A lot of what's been read is up for debate. Although typically a woman does not know she's pregnant until potentially not till almost the end of the first trimester, because you have to skip a certain number of periods before people know that they're actually having a child. And there could be other signs too. But so this idea of a child that either is aborted or born dead. Okay, so this is a child that does not make it into the world. there now tends to be a tendency to romanticize that. Like the church next door to my house, attached to the same cemetery, has its little monument to the unborn or something. They have some kind of thing. And, so that we tend to view the unborn as these kind of angelic souls. If people who have more, I don't know, I'm going to call them, I don't like to use the term New Age. Some of it is New Age. But, people who have different kinds of beliefs that maybe also might entail not only that, but also people who might believe in certain types of reincarnation or things like that, have beliefs that are more in that genre of whatever type, might think that the unborn, the unborn soul, it's just like, okay, so now this soul's not going to enter this body, it'll enter a different one. Like there's that kind of potential mentality as far as this idea of consciousness, being this consciousness that is somehow separate from the body or then later becomes embodied. And I think and so this idea though of this unborn child as demonic is interesting, especially since this is a pre-Christian idea. But of course, remembering too that when we're talking about the demonic here, we're not talking about demons in hell, kind of things that we've gained from certain types of folklore connected usually to Christianity, but maybe not exclusively, but mostly, because that idea of devil and the demons and all that kind of stuff certainly comes out of certainly a body of literature connected to certain aspects of Christian theology. Now, the unborn in Christian theology are supposedly said to go, and actually, that's not accurate. Let me take that back immediately. In Christian folklore, is said to be limbo. Okay, there's the idea of going to heaven, hell, purgatory, or limbo. Not purgatory because it's assumed that the child has not lived and therefore cannot commit a sin. But nonetheless, because they're not baptized, then they can't go to heaven. So then they end up in this, and right now when we talk about being in limbo, we talk about being like in this in-between state. And it's quite similar to what we see about the dead of all stripes in Greek thinking, connected to the Aori, who are restless souls that, for whatever reason, are not able to cross into Hades. And, often it's because, something was not done properly with a funeral rite. It could be because somebody has died. And this seems to be frequently associated with violent death, which is considered to be untimely. Somebody entering the underworld before their, what should be their natural lifespan or time, or before they have fulfilled whatever their perceived social role is. With women, of course, that would be to have children. So we see a lot of figures associated, like Mormo and Gello and the Lamia, who are associated with child stealing, but are also connected with women who die in childbirth or die before they're able to, as virgins, unable to give birth. So there's this whole thing around fertility in different ways. I mean, there's people have a problem with barrenness. So you have the old witchy woman or the old woman who has the, these properties, because she's barren, she's, you see the Baba Yaga types or, Dhumavati among the Mahavidyas, the widow, who has an energy that is considered to be dangerous. Because it's the woman who is past childbearing years. So she no longer has that power of generation, which, again, in ancient times would have been a lot more important. And so we have it around barren women. We have it around virgins who haven't, done their part, I suppose, to bring about the immortality of the family or the oikos or the household. Because she has not borne any children to continue the generations on. And, and then of course, then we have this idea of the woman who also acts outside the social role by having sex, by her own, sovereignty and discriminating on her own terms, or just offering herself freely if that's what she wants to do, or doing it for money or whatever. A woman who, is sexually free and not bound by, the confines of marriage now is also considered to be a threat to this kind of order. because then there's this idea that you are bearing children or trying to continue a line outside of what's considered to be the organized or structured family unit. The idea of a child born outside of that somehow, again, kind of like almost on being outside of the tribe or outside, because it's generally taking place in some kind of secretive or nefarious kind of way, or in a way that is not socially approved in some fashion. So, there, and of course, again, these are ideas that don't wear well in today's world. There obviously are people who they are still part of the collective unconscious of this culture, to be sure. And you're not really going to get away from them because they're so embedded. Because even when we talk about women being free to do what they want, there's still an element of judgment that you will see, even if it's passive judgment, that tends to be attached to that. And it's and in a society now that has trouble dealing with anything that's out of certain confines where people feel safe. This becomes this is a pretty regular problem, I would say. It's something in culture that we really need to let go of as a culture, because a woman can be a sovereign. Marriage is not really a big thing anymore. People do still get married. I don't want to say that they don't and that there aren't successful marriages. But there's a lot standing in a way, this idea of the long-term committed monogamous relationship, is becoming something, it's harder and harder to maintain. And again, those kinds of relationships there's advantages and disadvantages to them. Okay. There's good and there's bad about it. Like anything. Anybody who's married will tell you that there's wonderful things about it, and that there's things that are absolutely taxing and trying and draining, and, because that's life. And when you elect to spend your life with somebody like that, the notion of what it's supposed to be versus what it is not, doesn't always hold up. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not worth pursuing, but it's not for everybody. And we don't live in a world necessarily that is bound by those kinds of social constraints anymore, which freaks a lot of people out, which is why there's this rather, that's at least one reason, in my opinion, for this authoritarian clampdown on things. The idea that we have to kind of get back to these kinds of values and structure, because somehow the fact that the whole world is changing, rather than flowing with the change, we want to say, no, we need to stem the tide here and put up the dam and stagnate the waters here back to the way that it used to be, which, again, may have served a purpose at a certain time. It really doesn't serve a purpose in today's world. We have to adapt to what this world is. And people, and there's an attempt to be more open and more fluid and more inclusive about a lot of things. And then there's a lot of people who rebel against that, who still have this as part of the collective mindset that has not really, it hasn't gone away. So, okay, so back to our Latawica. Okay, so this idea of the unborn child as a demon. Okay, so this potentially could be this idea of the child in limbo, quote unquote. Although, again, this is a pre-Christian way of thinking. So, nonetheless, certainly it was in the thinking about going, crossing the river into Hades. There was also the idea that one could be stuck in between in this kind of liminal space. It's funny, now there's kind of a mythology of what they call the back room. I may actually do a separate piece on that, which supposedly came out of a creepypasta. But nonetheless, it's an idea that's still floating around about this liminal space that is actually quite a terrifying space. Because there's nothing in it but, creatures that are, bound to attack you, So it's almost like a more modern version of this myth of being kind of stuck in between. And when we look at these figures, you're looking at winged figures. So they have all the attributes of that idea of the soul or the anima as being, a being that's acquired their wings in some fashion. But they're not, going to heaven or whatever, which again, not an ancient idea. They become wind elementals, as it were, and elementals associated with storms. Now, how these beings have become associated with seductive men or women, perhaps, that's interesting. That seems to me to be more of a Christian inflection, and I'll talk in a minute why I think that is. But again, we just have this idea of the, you have to remember too that unborn children, first of all, abortion was more common than people think back in those days. And, it's not because there are certain herbs and things like that. Mugwort oil was certainly one of those. Pennyroyal is also considered to be an abortive substance. I remember when I needed mugwort oil for something back, and then right after they had outlawed it, because they said women were going to use the mugwort extract to cause miscarriages. And I remember the owner of the metaphysical store that I went at the time was really, really angry about it. Like, he's like, it has this one side effect and it has so many good side effects and people are going to ban it for that. But yeah, this idea, which again, then there's the whole question of women getting to make the decision as to whether or not they want to carry a child. There tends to be an extreme focus on the child itself as a living being with a soul. But first of all, at a time when the child would probably be nothing more than a bunch of cells or a zygote, women are also, they're trying to take away the choice of women to be able to terminate it at that stage. Like the morning after pills and stuff like that. There's a whole lot around that, which to me, I'm thinking, so basically it's saying you don't have any choice at all. It's from the moment of conception, you have no choice. Which potentially, if you wanted to legally follow that through, has a whole lot of other implications. But okay, so we all know having a child is potentially dangerous for a woman. We know that having a child, and you're bringing another human being into the world that has to be fed, clothed, educated, sheltered. And, frequently the people who are very much in favor of keeping the fetus to full term are also people who are not in favor of supporting the child after they're born. There was actually even a nun, I think it was Sister Joan, what's her last name? Chitiska or Chitika? I can't remember exactly how her last name is pronounced or how it's spelled. Or Chittister, I think is what it was. She referred to that as not being pro-life, but being pro-birth, which is pretty much, you can't call yourself pro-life if you're not interested in that human being all the way up through the end of its life. But to me, pro-life also, my problem with it fundamentally is that it becomes a denial of death and a denial of nature and the way it works, because miscarriages are actually quite common in nature among all species. And some pregnancies are successful and some are not. That's just how it goes. So there's this idea here that, that the soul, assuming there is a soul or a consciousness to that, that fetus that has died, that now it's become, this kind of, wind elemental or wind spirit. And it's not, this is not a totally, we hear about this too, about people who, when we had talked about the figures that were the Rusalki, that the idea that these were women who might have drowned, for example, now having a connection to water or to water, water spirits in some fashion. And, so there's this idea of, if you die in a way that is, that leaves you in a liminal space, then you become part of that liminal space, right? You're part of the beings that are in that liminal space. That's what becomes of you, in theory, in this way of thinking. And and again, so it's not uncommon, to think of the idea of the soul as either embodying an animal or embodying an element or embodying something else. I mean, it's not probably quite a common ancient belief that there would be a connection there, that you would now, you come out of the natural world and then you return to it in some fashion. Now, if we look at the Christian idea here, so the connection to unbaptized children, I've talked about. But also it's interesting because now there ends up being a moral component that's added to it, that it has to do with sex, and particularly with promiscuous sex, because I think there's an assumption there that would be, there seems to be an almost implicit assumption there that abortion would be taking place among promiscuous women who are not looking necessarily to be mothers. Okay, they may be carrying on a trade, or they just may want to carry on and not want to settle into family life of some type. So, so they might have an abortion. So maybe, and that is a frequent argument that you will see. I remember being in Ireland when there was the case of that woman who, there's a female dentist who had, I think she was actually just a visitor to Ireland. I heard different things. Some say that she actually lived there. Others say that she was a visitor. But nonetheless, she was 7 months pregnant and went septic. Like, when you have sepsis, we all know that that's really like life-threatening, deadly serious. And she was going to die, and so was the child. And so they wanted to abort the child so they could at least save her. And they said, absolutely not. And I mean, now some people say, well, that's due to the laws in Ireland, which have now changed since that time. While abortion is still frowned upon in Ireland, at least, and there's not really many doctors that'll do it. People still often frequently go to England or Northern Ireland or somewhere else to get abortions. And of course, and still taboo to tell people that you've had one. Nonetheless, the law allows it in emergency circumstances. So, but there's a lot of people who still don't want to perform it. And I've had at least one friend who lives in Ireland say to me, yeah, well, the doctors, in the case that came up, the doctors could have saved her. They chose not to. So, and again, this was not a woman who was, quote unquote promiscuous. She was married woman. But, frequently late-term abortions are because the woman, because there's going to be death to both parties. And to me, people say that you shouldn't perform the abortion. Then frankly, you're looking to murder two people is what you're looking at, as far as I'm concerned. I have pretty strong views on abortion. So if anybody listening to this happens to be against abortion, well, I mean, you're entitled to your point of view, but that's not mine. I feel that should be a right of a woman because it does frequently have to do with your health and the care of your body and so many other things that are attached to it. But we put this sacredness on it that then tends to be thrown away. At least certainly in the United States. I can't necessarily speak for other places. But there's definitely, people are not interested in helping children once they're born. If they're born in circumstances where the person wanted to have an abortion for, economic reasons or, complete lack of support or whatever, So when we Christianize it, now we're looking at these as figures. So first of all, then there's this element of seduction. So there's this idea of, first of all, being enticed into sex that is, sinful, right? In that way of thinking, that you're being seduced by a figure that's almost like weirdly like a beautiful anima or animus figure, which, by strict definition, we're talking about, that's a term associated with birds. So that's kind of interesting. But the fact that they're connected with unborn children, whether we're thinking, are these unborn children trying to be born again in some way, in some fashion, or trying to get revenge on people for their loss, or just this idea of, turning them into demonic creatures, saying, well, this is the consequence of having an abortion or of being promiscuous, which is really kind of strange because stillborn children and children who are, who might be aborted, it's not necessarily within the context of somebody who is promiscuous. It can be within perfectly normal family situations that could happen. But there may have been an attempt to create a fear around the idea of having an abortion, or just simply as a means of saying, if there's something that was common in somebody who engaged in promiscuous behavior, as another way of trying to say, well, if you engage in promiscuous behavior and abort your child becomes a demon, right? And somehow in that demonic state becomes associated with, with creating more of that behavior, right? With seduction. So it's a really kind of a weird, an interesting kind of thing. And I love the fact that it's associated with winds and storms because there's that, it adds that element of drama and, almost the sex appeal of a storm, but that's also destructive and frightening at the same time. And of course, there's a whole lot too that we've seen about spirits of the air as being, interpreted as these kinds of, well, I mean, actually spirits of any type, but these as being spirits who are especially deceptive or tricky or demonic in some fashion. So so this kind of line between the promiscuous woman and the unborn child, I mean, there's like a judgment there. There's a way of saying that, this is something that is done by promiscuous women. And what I was saying, because I like to sidetrack myself, what I was saying about being in Ireland, I was in Galway at the time when the Taoiseach at that time, who was Enda Kenny, was questioning the abortion laws of Ireland. And the Irish Times was reporting on it. I was reading it in the paper. And they said that that the officials from the church, because of course the Catholic Church, Catholic religion's written into the Catholic Constitution, although I think they're making more and more of an effort to write it out at this point. But they, one of the bishops stood up and said, no, we can't, we cannot allow abortion at all because, I quote, it will encourage loose behavior in women. Okay, so this connection between abortion and the woman who is sexually liberal in some fashion, and this to me is an aspect of the dark feminine, the woman who has sovereignty over her own body and over her own sexual choices. That's not something that's part of the Christian model of femininity, and not just Christianity. I mean, certainly any kind of religion that deals with social proper hierarchies, that the woman is supposed to, she's supposed to remain a virgin until she's married, and she's supposed to only have sex to, propagate the species, be fruitful and multiply, however you want to look at that, create the immortality of the family, and this was not any different in the state religions either. And maybe could have been seen to be a more important factor in carrying on, quote unquote, the tribe. But certainly not in a day when we are overflowing with, I forget how many billions of people now on the earth, probably not quite so necessary, okay? So I feel like, there's definitely, certainly we're seeing in this kind of mythology and the shift in a mythology like this. In Poland now, certainly, although, again, I know Joanna and I have talked about the fact that Poland does seem to be trying to go more back towards some of its more pagan roots, and the Slavic countries in general haven't always strongly adhered to Christianity or stuck with it. But we do know that Poland has kind of, at least in recent years, has been a more Catholic country. So it's so again, there's still, it's interesting to see the way in which those old legends are kind of repurposed to try to make a moral point, or to try to take the feminine force that is associated with Latawica and turn it into something that's degraded, or to turn it into something that represents the consequence of not following the obedient model, the model of the feminine in submission to the masculine in some way, and that's and this is just the way that you can see that this changes in the folklore, at least on one level. So that's all I'm going to actually say on that subject. There's a lot of it's very interesting, and it still brings up that question to me about the idea of the feminine as the feminine that is allowed to have its own sovereignty, especially when it comes to childbearing, is somehow demonic or evil. One of the things I've talked about, sorry, this is the last thing I'll say about it, but for some reason I'm thinking of the movie The Exorcist, where, the original one with Linda Blair, and the one in which her mother is a single mom, and she's independent and successful woman. And then what does her daughter do? She starts playing with the Ouija board, starts getting involved with the witchcraft, and then she gets possessed by this Babylonian demon, who's weirdly the demon in The Exorcist is actually, Pazuzu is actually a demon that's supposed to actually help with childbirth. But it's, but again, there's a chapter in this book by W. Scott Poole, trying to remember the name of it. I think it's called Monsters in America. And he gets a lot into these horror tropes that are connected to female sexuality. And a lot of these movies that he has said came out around the time when birth control was first becoming a thing in the late 60s. And of course, the encyclical against it from the Pope at the time. And, this idea of, and there's always this stress on the family and family values, right? The idea that the feminine is supposed to be within this certain kind of a confine, and, that the sexually liberal female only breeds the demonic, Okay. So in a way, I feel like that is the idea that's being expressed here by the way the original myth of the Latawica as this, the unborn child who becomes the spirit of the wind, is now, now has become this demonic figure that is, more or less saying this is the consequences of abortion, or this is the consequences of, children not being born, like the bad juju that comes along with that, So interesting to think about. Thank you again for listening. As always, if you want to check out all of my work, please visit Chthonia.net. Because I have the podcast, but I also have publications. I also, offer classes. And, you can follow me on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter and Instagram, 2 words on Facebook. And if you would like to become a patron and get extra podcasts, now I'm making a point of doing podcasts, maybe with a few exceptions, but I now do the extra podcasts every single week for Patreon subscribers at the $5 level and above. So, so if you do the $1, it's a, thanks very much, and for your support kind of a thing. And then, as the levels move up, there's more and more associated with that. So if that interests you, it's patreon.com/Chthonia. Thank you again so much for listening, and until the next episode.